decided to come back to campus a week early during winter break to get ahead on a group project. Yeah, not my best idea. Most students were still gone, and the dorms felt like a ghost town. The only people around were a few RA staff and maintenance workers, but even they seemed scarce. My roommate Clara was still in California, soaking up the sun, while I was stuck in a freezing dorm in Ohio. Lucky me. When I checked into my tower, the receptionist had to reactivate my key card. She warned me, "You're one of the only ones back on your floor, so it might feel quiet." Quiet wasn't the word I'd use. It was dead silent. I felt a chill as I stepped into the elevator. My dorm tower has 12 floors, and I live on the 8th. Normally there's a ton of activity, people running to class, music blasting, but now, nothing. My floor was completely empty. Most of the rooms belonged to international students who went home for the holidays. The eerie silence hit me as soon as I stepped off the elevator. I unlocked my door, tossed my bags inside, and tried to shake off the weird vibe. I noticed something strange, though. The room 2 doors down had its door slightly open. I hesitated, but I didn't want to look nosy, so I let it go. Maybe someone forgot to close it before break. That night, I set up my laptop on my bed and started watching some YouTube videos to relax. The hum of my heater was the only sound in the room, and I tried not to think about how empty the place felt. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard it, the sound of a key card being swiped. It was so distinct, like the beep at a hotel door. I paused my video, my heart racing. Maybe someone else was back on the floor. I stared at my door, waiting for footsteps or something, but everything went quiet again. I got up and peeked through the peephole. Nothing. Just the dimly lit hallway. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to rig a little alarm system to ease my paranoia. I grabbed a roll of string from my desk and tied it between my door handle and the frame. If anyone opened the door, it would snap, and I'd know someone had been inside. It felt silly, but it made me feel a little safer. The next day, I told myself I was overthinking everything. It's probably just nerves from being alone. I spent most of the day at the library trying to stay out of my creepy, empty dorm as much as possible. That night, I was back in bed, scrolling through Reddit on my phone. The heater hummed softly in the background, lulling me into a false sense of security. Then, just like clockwork, I heard it again. The keycard beep. My body froze. This time, the door opened. I heard it creak as it swung inward, followed by the faint sound of footsteps. Someone was inside my room. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I stayed completely still, gripping my phone like a lifeline. The string alarm snapped. Whoever it was took a few steps into the room. I could hear them bump into my chair. And then, silence. I must have made a sound because the next thing I heard was the footsteps retreating, the door clicking shut, and their steps fading down the hallway. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. When I finally worked up the courage, I saw the snapped string lying on the floor and my chair slightly out of place. Whoever it was had been there, no doubt about it. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I messaged my RA and told her everything. I explained how I heard the keycard beep, how someone had been in my room, and how they left after snapping my makeshift alarm. She replied pretty quickly, saying it was probably just a mix-up, a maintenance worker or maybe someone who had the wrong key. But here's the thing. Maintenance staff aren't allowed to enter dorm rooms without prior notice, and no one else was supposed to be on my floor. I tried to convince myself it was a harmless mistake. Maybe someone new had moved in early for spring semester. It didn't make sense, but it was easier to believe that than anything worse. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, I moved my chair in front of the door and slid my suitcase against it just in case. I told myself it was over, that whoever it was wouldn't come back. But I was wrong. Around 3 a.m., I was lying in bed, scrolling through TikTok trying to stay awake just in case. Then, like clockwork, I heard the beep. My heart dropped. I froze as the door creaked open again. This time I could see the silhouette of someone standing in the doorway, their figure outlined by the faint light from the hallway. They stood there for what felt like forever, not moving, just watching. I didn't know what to do. I could feel my phone in my hand, but I was too scared to even breathe. I stayed as still as possible, praying they would leave. Finally, I decided to act. I hit play on a random video I had queued up earlier. The sound of a cheerful ad blasted through the room, shattering the silence. The figure jolted, turned, and disappeared out the door. The door clicked shut, and I heard their footsteps fading away. When I finally got up the courage to check, the string I had tied to the door earlier was snapped again. My chair had been pushed slightly to the side. Whoever it was had definitely been in my room. The next morning, I marched straight to the front desk. I told the receptionist everything. The noises, the broken string, the person standing in my doorway. She looked genuinely concerned and promised to check the logs for any keycard activity on my floor. Later that afternoon, she called me back. "There's no record of anyone using a key to access your door during the times you mentioned," she said. "What?" I asked, my voice shaking. "That's not possible. I heard the keycard beep twice." "I know," she said, hesitating, "but the logs don't show anything. Are you sure you weren't imagining?" "I wasn't imagining it," I snapped, trying to stay calm. She said she would report it to campus security and have them look into it further, but her tone told me she wasn't taking it as seriously as I was. Frustrated, I texted Clara, my roommate, telling her what happened. She was still in California, but freaked out when I told her everything. "Dude, this is insane. You need to stay somewhere else. What if it's someone dangerous?" But where would I go? Everyone else was still gone for the break. The dorm was my only option. That night, I decided I wasn't going to be a sitting duck anymore. I downloaded a security app on my phone and set up motion alerts. I even balanced a few empty cans on top of the chair I'd placed in front of the door. If someone tried to come in again, I'd know. And this time, I'd be ready. I stayed awake as long as I could, watching the hallway through the peephole and refreshing my security app every few minutes. But as the hours ticked by, the anxiety started to wear me down. Eventually, I dozed off. I woke up to the sound of cans crashing to the floor. My heart leapt into my throat. It was happening again. The keycard beep echoed through the room, followed by the slow creak of the door opening. I stayed completely still, clutching my phone, ready to hit the emergency dial. This time, the intruder didn't stop at the doorway. I could hear their footsteps as they moved further into the room. They stepped on the cans, crunching them underfoot. My makeshift barrier of a chair and suitcase barely slowed them down. I could see their silhouette now, backlit by the faint hallway light spilling in through the door. They were tall, their movements deliberate. I held my breath as they paused near my desk, their head tilting slightly as if studying something. I knew I had to act. With my trembling fingers, I opened my camera app and hit record. The figure shifted, their shadow stretching across the wall as they turned towards my bed. And then they froze. Maybe they realized I was awake, or maybe they saw the faint glow of my phone screen. Without a word, they turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind them. I sat there in stunned silence, my hands shaking as I stopped the recording. My heart was pounding, but I knew I had captured something, proof that I wasn't imagining this. When I finally got up to check the door, the cans were scattered across the floor, and my chair was pushed halfway across the room. Whoever it was, they had no intention of stopping. The next morning, I took my phone to the front desk. I showed the receptionist the video. It wasn't much, just the shadowy outline of someone moving in my room. But it was enough to prove I wasn't making this up. Her face went pale. "We'll escalate this to campus security immediately," she said. A few hours later, I was sitting in a cramped office with a campus security officer. He was middle-aged, with a tired expression that suggested he'd seen his fair share of weird campus stories. "We checked the keycard logs for the past 3 days," he said, flipping through a clipboard. "There's no record of anyone accessing your room at those times." "How is that possible?" I asked, my voice rising. "You're telling me someone can just bypass your system and get into my room whenever they want?" He sighed. "It's not supposed to happen. But if someone has access to the master override key, What's a master override key? It's a special card used by maintenance staff and some administrative personnel. It can unlock any door in the dorms. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. So you're saying it could be someone who works here? He hesitated before nodding. It's a possibility, but those keys are logged and we haven't seen any unusual activity. Then how do you explain this? I demanded, holding up my phone. We'll investigate further, he said, his tone careful but unconvincing. In the meantime, I suggest keeping your door locked and reporting anything unusual. I left the office feeling more frustrated than ever. They clearly didn't have a plan, and I wasn't about to sit around waiting for this person to come back. That night, I set up my phone to record the entire room while I slept. I propped it up on my desk, pointed towards the door, and hit record. I wasn't sure if it would catch anything, but I had to try. I barely slept, my ears tuned to every creak and shuffle in the building. By morning, I had hours of footage to review, and that's when I saw it. At 3:17 a.m., the door opened. A figure stepped inside, moving slowly, almost cautiously. They didn't look around this time. They went straight to my desk, pausing briefly before turning back towards the door. As they left, I noticed something chilling. They weren't wearing any kind of uniform. Whoever this was, they didn't belong here. I couldn't take it anymore. This wasn't just someone confused or in the wrong room. Whoever it was, they knew what they were doing. They kept coming back, and I had no idea why. I decided to take matters into my own hands. The next day, I borrowed a mini camera from a friend on campus who was into photography. It was small enough to hide above the door frame, pointed straight at the entrance. I also adjusted my phone to cover a wider angle of the room, making sure nothing would go unnoticed. To make it even more convincing, I left my bed unmade and my laptop open on my desk, as if I'd fallen asleep watching something. I wanted the room to look inviting, like I wasn't expecting them. I sat in the dark, heart pounding, waiting for the inevitable. Sure enough, around 3:15 a.m., I heard the keycard beep. The door creaked open, and the silhouette appeared again. My breathing slowed as I watched them step inside, moving with the same eerie caution as before. This time they went further into the room, stopping near my desk. I gripped my phone tightly, pretending to sleep, while every muscle in my body screamed at me to run. They hovered by my laptop, their face partially illuminated by the glow of the screen. And then they did something I wasn't expecting. They opened the drawer on my desk. I felt my stomach drop. What were they looking for? My homework? My personal stuff? Before I could react, they closed the drawer and turned toward the door. Just as they stepped out, I heard something clatter to the floor. When the door shut, I bolted out of bed and grabbed the object. It was a small piece of metal, like a tool of some kind. My hands shook as I checked my cameras. The footage was clear. I could see their face this time, even though they wore a hood. And I could tell one thing for sure: they weren't a student. The next morning, I didn't bother going to the front desk. I went straight to campus security, video in hand. The officer I spoke to looked genuinely alarmed as he watched the footage. "This changes things," he muttered. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. He hesitated. "The person in the video, that's not someone authorized to be here. It could be a contractor or someone who got a hold of a master key. Either way, they shouldn't have access to student rooms." "Then why haven't you done anything about this?" I snapped. "We're going to take this seriously now," he said. "I promise. Leave this with us." But that wasn't enough for me. I needed answers. That night, I stayed awake, scrolling through every forum, every social media post I could find about campus safety issues. And then I found it. A post from a former student who claimed that years ago, a maintenance worker had been caught sneaking into dorms during breaks. It was buried in an old Reddit thread, but the details matched too closely to ignore. The worker had been fired, but never formally charged, and no one knew what happened to him after. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Could it be the same person? That night I couldn't sleep. Every noise made my heart race. Every creak of the building felt like a warning. Around 3 a.m. I heard the beep again. My stomach turned to ice as the door opened. I didn't move, didn't breathe. This time I was ready. My phone was in my hand, already recording. The intruder stepped inside, moving with the same unnerving confidence as before. But this time, instead of staying quiet, I whispered, "I see you." They froze. For a second, neither of us moved. Then, like a startled animal, they bolted for the door. I jumped out of bed and followed, phone in hand, recording every step. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing down the empty hallway. The figure turned the corner, and by the time I reached the elevator, they were gone. The next morning, campus security reviewed the footage and finally connected the dots. The man was a former employee, a maintenance worker who had been fired years ago. Somehow he'd kept a master key card and had been sneaking into dorms ever since. They caught him 2 days later, trying to access another tower. I'd like to say that was the end of it, that I slept soundly after that. But even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. My dorm still feels too quiet, too exposed. And every time I hear the beep of a key card, my heart skips a beat. If you're watching this, just be careful. Lock your doors, trust your gut, and don't ignore the feeling that something isn't right. Because sometimes, it isn't. It was the winter of 2015. I was 20 years old, juggling college classes during the week and working nights at a gas station on weekends. Not the most glamorous job, but hey, it paid the bills. This station was smack dab on the edge of a small town in the US with nothing but snow-covered fields and a 2-lane highway stretching into darkness. Quiet, isolated, and honestly kind of creepy at night. The station itself wasn't much to look at. A small convenience store with a single row of pumps. Winters here were brutal, and that night was no different. The wind howled through the cracks in the doors, and everything outside was blanketed in white. Most nights I spent my shifts stocking shelves, cleaning counters, and serving the occasional trucker. The kind of work that makes you feel like time's crawling. But this night, it started like any other. Around 11 p.m., I settled into my usual routine, mopping the floor, sipping on lukewarm coffee, and trying not to think about how much I hated working weekends. By 1 a.m., the world outside was dead quiet. No cars, no headlights, just the faint glow of our buzzing neon sign reflecting on the snow. That's when I noticed someone, out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. There was this figure standing just outside the range of the station's lights, near the old rusted highway sign. They weren't moving, just standing there. It was too dark to make out any details, just the outline of a bulky winter coat and maybe a hood. I figured it was someone waiting for a ride or maybe just passing through. People did weird stuff out here. I kept one eye on them while pretending to busy myself at the counter, but they didn't budge. 15 minutes turned into 30, then an hour. They just stood there like a statue. By 2:30, the unease started to creep in. My gut was telling me something wasn't right. I mean, who stands out in freezing temperatures for hours without moving? But I convinced myself I was overthinking it. Maybe they were lost or drunk or both. Then a customer walked in, a middle-aged guy with a thick coat and a scruffy beard. He grabbed some snacks and a coffee, and while I was ringing him up, he casually asked, "Hey, you see that guy outside? Been standing there for a while now." My stomach dropped. "Yeah," I muttered, trying to sound calm. "Weird, huh?" The guy nodded, his face serious. "Weird's one way to put it. Be careful, kid." And with that, he left, the door slamming shut behind him. I glanced back toward the window. The figure was still there, and for the first time I swear I saw their head tilt like they were looking right at me. By now, my nerves were shot. I tried to focus on my tasks, cleaning the coffee station, restocking chips, checking expiration dates. But every time I glanced out the window, that figure was still there. It felt like a game, like they were daring me to come out. Around 3:30 a.m., I decided to take a break and check the security cameras. The system wasn't great, but it gave me a view of the pumps, the parking lot, and part of the highway. I rewound the footage to see if I could catch when the figure had arrived. What I saw made my blood run cold. The figure wasn't in the footage, not once. It was like they'd never been there. But when I looked out the window again, there they were, as clear as day, standing in the same spot. I tried calling the cops, but of course the storm had knocked out the phone lines. My cell had no signal either. Great, just great. Now I was stuck, alone, with no way to call for help. I double-checked the locks on the doors and sat behind the counter, my heart pounding. By 4:30, the figure started to move, slowly, deliberately. They walked toward the edge of the light, stopping just outside the range of the cameras. I couldn't see their face, just that same bulky coat and hood. I felt like a deer in headlights, frozen, unsure of what to do. Then the power went out. I don't remember moving, but the next thing I knew, I was hiding in the back office with the door locked and a wrench clutched in my hands. My breathing was so loud it felt like it echoed in the tiny room. I kept telling myself it was just the storm, just a power outage, but deep down I knew better. When the lights flickered back on, I hesitated before leaving the office. The cameras were working again, so I checked the feed first. Nothing. No figure. No movement. Just the empty parking lot coated in snow. But then I saw it. The front door. The glass was fogged up like someone had been standing right against it, breathing. I didn't hear the door open, didn't see anyone on the cameras, but the fog was fresh. My stomach churned. At 6 a.m. my shift ended, and my coworker finally showed up. I told him everything, but he just laughed it off, saying I'd been working too many night shifts. I wasn't sticking around to argue. I grabbed my stuff and called a cab. No way was I walking home in the dark. As the cab pulled away from the station, I glanced out the window one last time. And there they were, standing at the edge of the parking lot, watching. My heart raced, but I didn't say a word. I just told the driver to go faster. I never went back to that job. To this day, I don't know who or what that figure was. But every winter when the nights get long and the snow starts falling, I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, waiting for someone else to notice them. I never thought I'd be telling this story to anyone, let alone sharing it here. It's one of those memories you try to lock away, but it creeps back, especially on cold, stormy nights. This happened during the brutal winter of 2014, one of the coldest I can remember. My dad, David, had just gotten a new job, which meant we had to move, 9 hours away from the only home I'd ever known. Mom and my sisters flew ahead, leaving Dad and me to drive the car to our new house. Most of our stuff was already on the moving truck, but we still had a few important things in the trunk. Now here's the kicker. I was 17 and just learning to drive. Dad thought this trip would be the perfect practice. Nothing like highway driving to build confidence, he'd said with a grin. But I wasn't smiling. The forecast showed a massive snowstorm hitting right in the middle of our route. Driving in snow as a newbie? No thanks. We left at 3 p.m., aiming to arrive before midnight. The first few hours were fine. Quiet roads, cold air biting at the windows, and Dad humming to some old rock songs. But as the sun dipped, the clouds rolled in, thick and heavy, like a warning. By 8 p.m., we were in it. A full-blown snowstorm. Visibility dropped to near zero, and I was gripping the wheel so hard my fingers started to ache. "Just keep it steady," Dad said calmly, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. But then it happened. The car skidded. I panicked, slamming the brakes, which only made it worse. We slid off the road, narrowly missing a tree. When we finally stopped, my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. We got out to check the damage. Miraculously, there was only a small dent near the rear bumper. I laughed, a nervous, relieved kind of laugh. But my relief didn't last long. That's when I noticed headlights cutting through the snow, heading straight for us. A black truck pulled up next to us, its high beams blinding. I squinted as the driver rolled down his window. He was an older guy, maybe in his 50s, with a big, forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You folks okay?" he called out, his voice overly friendly. "Yeah, we're fine," Dad answered, his tone clipped. He didn't like the guy. I could tell. "Well, good. But, I think you dropped something about a mile back. Looks like it fell out of your trunk." I frowned. "Are you sure? We haven't stopped since we left." The man nodded enthusiastically. "Oh yeah, it's in my back seat. Thought I'd bring it over so you wouldn't have to go back for it." Dad stiffened beside me. "We didn't lose anything," he said firmly. The man's smile faltered for a second before coming back wider than before. "Why don't you check just to be sure?" He gestured to his truck, where I could barely make out the outline of something on the seat. Against Dad's protests, I stepped forward. It didn't seem like a big deal, just a quick peek. But as I reached for the truck's door handle, Dad's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Jack, get back in the car. Now!" I froze, my hand hovering over the handle. Dad never yelled like that. Ever. The urgency in his voice sent a chill down my spine. I turned to him, confused, but the look on his face left no room for questions. I backed away slowly. "Get in the car," Dad repeated, calmer this time but no less serious. I obeyed, climbing into the driver's seat. Dad followed, locking the doors behind us. The man in the truck just stared, his smile gone, replaced by a cold, angry glare. Without another word, we drove off, the tires spinning slightly in the fresh snow. We didn't speak for a long time. The storm raged on outside, but the real tension was inside the car. Finally, Dad broke the silence. "I'm sorry for yelling," he said, his voice quieter now. "But I needed to stop you." "Why?" I asked, still shaken. "What was that guy's deal?" Dad hesitated, then said, "When you went to open his door, I saw them. 2 men were hiding on the other side of the truck, crouched low, waiting for you." My stomach dropped. "What? Are you serious?" He nodded. "They were trying to stay out of sight, but the light from the high beams gave them away. I don't know what they were planning, but it wasn't good." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. If I'd opened that door, I didn't even want to think about it. My hands started to tremble again, and I gripped the wheel tighter to steady them. When we finally reached our new house around 1 a.m., we checked the trunk. Everything was still there, just like we thought. That guy had been lying the whole time. Lying in bed that night, I couldn't shake the image of those men crouched and waiting. I kept thinking about how close I'd come to walking into a trap, and how lucky I was that Dad had seen it. So yeah, that's my story. It's been years, but every time I see snow piling up on the roads, I remember that night. And I'll never forget what my dad taught me. Trust your gut, because sometimes it's the only thing standing between you and danger. It was one of those freezing winter nights when the air bites your face just by stepping outside. I remember I was home alone that night. My sister Julia had picked up an extra shift at work and wouldn't be back until midnight. The house felt quieter than usual, with nothing but the occasional crackling from the fireplace breaking the silence. Our place is an old 2-story house in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees. Charming during the day, but once the sun goes down, it feels like you're in a horror movie. I had all the lights on, trying to keep myself calm, and I was curled up on the couch watching some cheesy rom-com, trying to pass the time. Julia always double-checks the locks before leaving, so I didn't bother checking myself. But as I sat there, wrapped in a blanket, I suddenly got this weird feeling in my chest, like something wasn't right. You know that heavy sinking feeling like you're being watched? I tried to shake it off and focus on the movie, but then I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. It came from outside, like something or someone was moving. I froze. At first, I convinced myself it was the wind or maybe a raccoon digging through the trash. But the sound came again, this time louder, like crunching footsteps in the snow. "Okay, Emma, don't freak out," I whispered to myself. But my heart was racing. I got up and tiptoed to the nearest window, peeking out through the curtain. All I could see was darkness and the faint outline of the snow-covered trees. Nothing. But then, as I moved to the kitchen to check another window, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the windows was slightly open. I knew for a fact I hadn't touched it all day. I quickly locked it and pulled the blinds down, but that feeling, the one like someone was watching me, grew stronger. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. I went back to the couch trying to act like everything was normal, but my mind was racing. I grabbed the remote and turned the TV volume down, just enough to hear what was going on around me. For a while it was quiet again, just the faint hum of the heater and the occasional pop from the fireplace. I started thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. Then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye through the window in the kitchen, a shadow moved. My heart skipped a beat. I sat frozen, staring at the window, waiting to see if it would move again. And that's when I saw him. A man, standing right outside the window, his face pressed against the glass. He wasn't moving, just staring into the house. He had this wild, scruffy beard that seemed to cover half his face, and his hair looked just as messy. But it was his eyes and that smile that shook me to my core. His eyes were dark and empty, like he was looking straight through me. And that smile, it wasn't a friendly smile. It was twisted, like he was enjoying my fear. I couldn't breathe. For a second I thought I was imagining it, like maybe it was just the reflection of a tree or something. But then he lifted his hand and started tapping on the glass. It wasn't loud, just this slow, deliberate tapping, like he wanted me to know he was there. That's when panic set in. I grabbed my phone and dialed Julia, straight to voicemail. Great. I thought about calling 911, but before I could, the tapping stopped. I looked back at the window. He was gone. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Not outside this time. Inside. They were faint but clear, moving through the hallway toward the living room. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the fireplace poker, holding it like a weapon, and slowly backed toward the corner of the room. Every creak in the floor made my pulse race. I knew I had to move, but where? The front door was too far, and I wasn't about to run upstairs like every dumb horror movie character. So I made a break for the pantry. It was small, but had a lock on the inside. I slipped in and shut the door, pressing myself against the wall. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the poker. And then, silence. I sat in that pantry, my back pressed against the wall, gripping the fireplace poker like it was my lifeline. The silence was deafening. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it was louder than my breathing. I strained to hear something, anything. But all I got was the creak of the house settling. For a second, I thought maybe I was safe, that maybe the man had left. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and way too close. They echoed down the hallway, heading straight for the kitchen. My stomach turned to ice. He was inside. I could barely keep my grip on the poker as I clutched it tighter, hoping the lock on the pantry door would hold if he found me. The footsteps stopped right outside the pantry. My breath caught. I could hear him now, his shallow breathing, the faint scrape of something in his hand against the door. And then a low chuckle. It was the kind of laugh you hear in nightmares, one that makes your skin crawl and your stomach drop. The doorknob rattled. Slowly at first, then more forcefully. "I know you're in there," he said, his voice rough and gravelly. My whole body froze. He started banging on the door and I felt like I was going to pass out from fear. But something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to just sit there and wait for him to get in. I gripped the poker and threw the pantry door open as hard as I could, slamming it into him. He stumbled back, surprised, but only for a second. His eyes locked on mine, wild and furious, and he lunged. I swung the poker with everything I had, hitting him in the arm, but it barely slowed him down. I ran. I didn't even look back. I bolted out of the kitchen and toward the front door. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face as I burst outside, but the snow slowed me down. My bare feet sank into it, and the freezing pain shot up my legs. I could hear him behind me, his boots crunching on the snow. He was catching up. And then, headlights. Bright, blinding headlights. Julia's car screeched into the driveway, the beams cutting through the dark. I waved my arms, screaming for her to stop. The man froze for a moment, then turned and bolted toward the woods. Julia jumped out of the car, panicked. "Emma, what the hell is going on?" I could barely speak, pointing toward the trees where the man had disappeared. Julia didn't ask questions. She grabbed her phone and called the cops while pulling me into the car. My whole body was shaking, and not just from the cold. When the police arrived, they searched the area but didn't find him. Just footprints in the snow that led deep into the woods. They said they'd patrol the area, but honestly, I didn't feel much safer. That night, Julia and I double-checked every lock in the house, and I slept in her room with every light on. To this day, I can't stop thinking about his face. Those empty eyes, that twisted smile. I never found out who he was or what he wanted, but I stopped leaving the windows open at night. And I never ever ignore that sinking feeling in my chest. Hey everyone, so I wanted to share this creepy experience that's been stuck with me ever since it happened. I was about 17 years old, and it was one of those freezing January nights. You know, the kind where the snow just doesn't stop falling. My little brother Kyle and I were home alone at our place in Vermont. Our parents had gone to visit some family friends in the city and weren't coming back until the next morning. Now, our house is pretty much in the middle of nowhere. It's surrounded by woods, and during the winter, the snow makes it even more isolated. So Kyle and I were just trying to kill time. We decided to stay up late in the living room, watching movies and eating way too much junk food. The snowstorm outside was wild, but honestly, it made the house feel kinda cozy, at first. About halfway through the second movie, I noticed Kyle kept glancing out the window. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured he was just zoning out or watching the snow, but then it started happening more and more. Every few minutes, I'd catch him turning his head to look outside. Finally, I asked, "What are you looking at?" He didn't take his eyes off the window and just mumbled, "I thought I saw something." That's when my stomach dropped. I tried to play it cool though, telling myself it was probably just the wind blowing the trees around or something. I mean, what else could it be? But then he whispered, "No, seriously, there's something out there." I got up and went to the window. At first, all I could see was snow swirling under the porch light. Nothing out of the ordinary. I turned back to Kyle and shrugged. "There's nothing out there," I said. But he didn't look convinced. We sat back down, but now I was on edge. A few minutes later, Kyle's head whipped around again. This time I didn't even ask. I just followed his gaze. And that's when I saw it. Out in the trees, maybe 50 yards away, a shadow moved. It was quick, darting from one tree to another, but it was definitely there. I froze. My first thought was that maybe it was a deer, but something about the shape and the way it moved didn't feel right. "You saw that, right?" Kyle asked, his voice shaky. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I saw it." We both stayed quiet, staring out the window. For a while, nothing happened, just the storm raging outside. I started to relax, convincing myself it was all in my head. But then, out of nowhere, another shadow moved. This one was closer, maybe 30 yards away. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. "What do we do?" Kyle whispered. "I don't know," I admitted. We decided to check all the doors and windows just to make sure everything was locked. As we moved through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on us. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. We went back to the living room, but neither of us sat down. Instead, we just stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. The snow was still coming down hard, but every now and then, we'd catch glimpses of movement between the trees. And it wasn't just one shadow anymore. There were at least two, maybe three. moving around out there. Why are they just standing there? Kyle asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, I said, trying to sound calm even though my heart was racing. Maybe they're lost or something. But I didn't believe that. Not for a second. Something about the way they moved, fast and deliberate, felt off. These weren't people who needed help. They were watching us. Then, one of the figures stepped out from behind a tree and stood perfectly still. It was closer than any of the others had been, maybe 20 yards from the house. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark silhouette against the snow. But it was enough to make my blood run cold. We need to call Mom and Dad, I said, grabbing my phone. But of course, there was no signal. The storm had knocked it out. What now? Kyle asked, his voice trembling. We stay inside, I said, and we don't open the door for anyone. As I said it, the figure started moving again. This time it was walking straight toward the house. I grabbed Kyle and pulled him away from the window. Come on, I said, dragging him toward the basement. We'll be safer down there. Our dad kept an old rifle in the basement, and while I'd never used it before, I figured it was better than nothing. Kyle was shaking as we made our way down the stairs, and honestly, I wasn't doing much better. My hands were trembling so much that I could barely load the gun. We sat there in the dark, listening. At first, it was just the wind howling outside, but then we heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the porch. My heart felt like it was going to explode. Do you think they're inside? Kyle whispered. I didn't answer. I didn't want to scare him any more than he already was. But deep down, I knew the answer. Whoever they weren't just outside anymore. We stayed in the basement all night, huddled together with the rifle between us. Every little creak or gust of wind made my heart race, but thankfully, nothing else happened. When the first light of morning crept through the basement window, I finally felt like I could breathe again. Let's go check, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Kyle nodded, and we both cautiously made our way upstairs. The living room was eerily quiet. The storm had stopped, leaving everything covered in a thick blanket of snow. At first, everything seemed normal, but then we saw it. Footprints, a trail of them leading from the trees straight to our porch. Kyle and I exchanged a look, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The footprints didn't stop at the porch, though. They circled the house, passing by every window and door. Whoever it was had been watching us all night. We found more tracks around the backyard leading to the shed. The door was wide open, and inside, some tools were missing, including a couple of our dad's hunting knives. That was when the full weight of it hit me. This wasn't just some prank. Whoever had been out there had come prepared. When our parents got back later that morning, we told them everything. At first, they thought we were exaggerating, but when Dad saw the footprints in the open shed, his face went pale. He called the police, something he rarely ever did. The cops came out and took a look around. They said the tracks suggested at least 3 people had been out there. They didn't find much else, though, and eventually they left, telling us to call if anything else happened. We moved out of that house a few weeks later, and honestly, I couldn't have been happier to leave. But even now, years later, I still think about that night, the way those shadows moved, the way they watched us. It's like something out of a nightmare, and it still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it.